Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are finally digging into chapter 1 of our new book, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelm. Um, Hope you guys will enjoy this as much as I did. For those who watch the introductory video, you kind of already know what this is going to be about, or at least the brief description of it. But again, I will post the bio of the author and the link to the book below in the description, so you guys can take a look at it and do some research yourselves if you are interested in buying the book or not. But other than that, let's get into it. So, chapter 1, don't think of a household. Myth number 1, the federal government should budget like a household. Reality, unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends. So, like many of you, I grew up watching the television show Sesame Street. One of the skills that helped young kids develop was the ability to sort objects according to their similarities and differences. Quote, one of these things is not like the other. The song began as the screen. A banana, an orange, a pineapple, and a sandwich. The sandwich, the sandwich. My sister and I would holler back at the TV. I'm no longer a kid, but I still find myself hollering back at the TV whenever I hear someone talk about the federal government's budget as if it were no different from a household budget. So, if you've heard someone complain that Washington needs to get its fiscal house in order, you've heard a version of the household myth. It derives from the flawed idea that we should look at Uncle Sam's budget through the same lens as we use to manage our own family budgets. Of all the myths we're going to explore in this pages ahead, this is undoubtedly the most pernicious. It's a favorite among politicians who tend to look for the simplest possible rhetoric to connect with their constituents. And what could be easier than describing the government's finances in terms the rest of us already understand? Our own. We all know it's important to keep our personal spending in line with our overall income. So when we hear someone come along and talk about government finances in ways that remind us of our own, it hits home. It's got a folksy kitchen table feel to it. We've all seen it done in campaign ads and town halls across America. Politicians point to the smallest businessman or the hard-working waitress, holding them up as a shining example of what responsible budgeting looks like. They emphasize with the struggles of everyday Americans, reminding us that all we know what it's like to sit around the kitchen table and balance a family checkbook. Then, in the hope of drawing outrage from the crowd, they shift the conversation to the federal government, telling us that Uncle Sam's books almost never balance because it's irresponsible spending has become a way of life in Washington, D.C. Stories like these resonate with us because the language is so familiar. We know that we're supposed to live within our means and arrange our finances so that we aren't spending more than we bring in. We know we need to set aside some savings for the future and that we should be extra careful when it comes to borrowing money. Taking on too much debt can lead to bankruptcy, foreclosures, and even incarceration. We know people can go broke. We've seen iconic companies like Radio Shack and Toys R Us get driven into bankruptcy. When they can no longer afford to pay the bills, even cities, Detroit, and states, Kansas, can run into big trouble when they're not bringing in enough money to cover their expenses. Every family sitting around the kitchen table understands these realities. What they don't understand is why the federal government, Uncle Sam, is different. To understand why, we go right into the heart of MMT. Now, one quick thing. Toys R Us is back, it's just under a different name, and they're pretty much the same company, so just to kind of put that out there for a fun little fact of the day. So, issuers versus users of currency. MMT takes as its starting point a simple and uncontrovertible fact. Our national currency, the US dollar, comes from the US government, and it can't come from anywhere else, at least not legally. Both the US Treasury and its fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve, have the authority to issue the US dollar. This might involve minting the coins in your pocket, printing up the bills in your wallet, or creating digital dollars known as reserves that exist only as electronic entries on bank balance sheets. The Treasury manufactures the coins, and the Federal Reserve creates the rest. Once you appreciate the significance of this reality, you'll be able to unravel many of the deficit myths on your own. Even though you may not have given it much thought before, something inside you probably already understands this basic truth. I mean, think about it. Can you create US dollars? Sure. You can earn them, but you can manufacture them? Maybe with high-tech engraving equipment, you could set up shop in your basement and produce something that looks very much like the US dollar. Or maybe you could hack into the computer at the Federal Reserve and type up some digital dollars. But we both know you'll end up in an orange jumpsuit if you get caught trying to counterfeit the currency. Don't counterfeit things, guys. It's illegal. Don't do it. That's because the U.S. Constitution grants the federal government the exclusive right to issue the currency. As the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis put it, the U.S. government is the sole manufacturer of dollars. The term monopoly refers, of course, to a market in which there is only one supplier of some product, since the federal government is the sole manufacturer of the US dollar. We can think of it as having a monopoly over the dollar itself. It's kind of like being given a super copyright, one that never expires, over the ability to make additional copies of the dollar. It's an exclusive power, articulated by our founders. It's not something households, businesses, or state and local governments can do. Only the federal government can issue our currency. Everyone else is merely a currency user. It's a special power that must be exercised with great care. Going back to Sesame Street, we can easily identify which of the things in Exhibit 1 is not like the others. The distinction between currency users and the currency users lie at the heart of MMT. And as we will see in the pages ahead, it has profound implications for some of the most important policy debates of our time, such as healthcare, climate change, Social Security, international trade, and inequality. To take full advantage of the special powers that accrue to the currency issuer, countries need to do more than just grant themselves exclusive right to issue the currency. It's also important they don't promise to convert their currency into something they could run out of. Example, gold or some other country's currency. Now, for those who may not be well-versed in U.S. history or may not know the history of the U.S. dollar, when America was first founded, just like several other countries across the globe, they relied on what? Gold and silver, copper, and metal. Metals. They didn't have the dollar until not too long ago, I believe. So before then, it was just, a bag of coins. That's why she brings this up. And they need to refrain from borrowing, taking on debt, and a currency that isn't their own. When a country issues its own non-convertible fiat currency and only borrows in its own currency, that country has attained monetary sovereignty. Countries with monetary sovereignty, then, don't have to manage their budgets as a household would. They can use their currency issuing capacity to pursue policies aimed at maintaining a full employment economy. Sometimes people ask me whether MMT applies to other countries outside the US. It does. Even though the US dollar is considered special because of its status as a global reserve currency, lots of other countries have the power to make their monetary systems work for the people. So, if you're reading this book outside the USA, don't assume there are no important lessons here for you and your country. On the contrary, MMT can be used to describe and improve the policy choices available to any country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. The US, Japan, like I mentioned in the intro, the UK, Australia, Canada, and many countries with little or no monetary sovereignty. Nations like Panama, Tunisia, Greece, Venezuela, and many more. MMT helps us to see why countries that fix their exchange rates, like Argentina did until 2001, or that take on debt denominated in a foreign currency, like Venezuela has done, undermine their monetary sovereignty and subject themselves to the kinds of constraints faced by other currency users, such as Italy, Greece, and other Eurozone countries. When countries with little or no monetary sovereignty fail to prioritize budget discipline, they can face unsustainable debts just like a household. In contrast, the United States never has to worry about running out of money. It can always pay the bills, even the big ones. The US can't end up like Greece, which gave up its monetary sovereignty when it stopped issuing the drachma in order to use the euro. America is not dependent on China or anyone else for financing. So to kind of break down what she's saying, for those who don't know, um, I think it was the 2008 crash. I believe that's around the time when Greece decided to, like, first of all, a lot of countries, went into huge bankruptcy or financial disaster. And because of that, Greece, contacted the World Bank and IMF, which is basically a neoliberal institution that purposely bankrupts countries and then gives them all this money they can never pay back. So that's what happened to Greece, and they're still recovering to this day. And they had their own currency, and they gave that out for all this other money they didn't need to. So that's kind of what she's talking about. So, most importantly, having monetary sovereignty means that a country can prioritize the security and well-being of its people without needing to worry about how to pay for it. And again, you hear that all the time in political discourse. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Well, one of the examples is, well, we spend trillions of dollars on military and bombing people, and we spend billions and blank checks to corporations. But then when they ask about how you're going to pay to get poor people welfare, they say we don't have the money. That's what she's talking about. So, next, Thatcher's backward dictum, tabs. In a now famous speech from 1983, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared that, quote, the state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can only do so by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. This was Thatcher's way of saying that the government's finances were constrained in the same way our personal finances are constrained. In order to spend more, the government would need to raise the money. Quote, we know that there is no such thing as public money, she added. Quote, there is only taxpayer money. And the British people wanted more from their government, they would have to foot the bill. Was it an innocent mistake or a carefully crafted statement designed to discourage the British people from demanding more from their government? I'm not sure. Regardless of her motives, Thatcher's remarks concealed the currency issuing power of the state. More than 3 decades later, political leaders and currency issuing nations like the UK and the US still talk as though we, the taxpayers, are the ultimate source of the government's money. As former British Prime Minister Theresa May put it more recently, the government doesn't have a, quote, magic money tree. Unless they make more of our money, we're told the government can't afford to top up spending on existing programs, much less fund ambitious new projects. Now, Theresa May, I believe she ended up leaving office around 2018, 2019 for the whole Brexit situation, among other terrible policies that she implemented. She was deeply conservative. So, now to most of us, the idea that the government must tax more to spend more probably sounds reasonable. And our politicians know it. They also know that the most of us don't want to see our taxes go up. So they twist themselves into knots, trying to figure out how to win votes by vowing to do big things without asking the majority of us to pay more. For example, Donald Trump promised the American people that Mexico would pay for the border wall, while Democrats have insisted that billionaires and Wall Street banks can foot the bill for many of their ambitious programs. The money has to come from somewhere, right? Actually, we've got it backwards. But before we get to that, let's walk through the conventional understanding so it'll be easier to contrast this backward thinking with the ways things actually work. Recall that the finances we understand best are our own, and we know that we need to come up with money before we spend. So, the idea that the federal government must collect funds in order to spend seems intuitively correct. Extrapolating from our own experiences, we know that we can't walk out of the department store with a new pair of shoes or drive away from the car dealership in a sporty new vehicle unless we come up with the financing first. According to conventional thinking, the government relies on 2 sources of funding. It can raise your taxes, or it can borrow your savings. Taxes allow the government to collect money from people who have it, which means taxes are looked upon as a way to transfer money to the federal government. If the government wants to spend more than it collects by taxing, it can raise additional funds by borrowing from savers. In either case, the idea is that the government must come up with the money before it can spend. That's how most of us have been taught to understand the government's fiscal operations. Taxing and borrowing comes first. Spending comes last. A handy mnemonic for the conventional way of thinking is tabs. Taxing and borrowing precede spending. because we've been trained to believe that. Like each of us, the government must, quote, find the money before it can spend. Everyone becomes obsessed with the questions. How are you going to pay for it? We've been conditioned to expect our elected officials to offer a blueprint that maps out the source of every new dollar they wish to spend. Even the most progressive candidates fear that they'll be eaten alive if their proposals add to the deficit. So borrowing is almost never an option. To show that their policies won't add to the deficit, they hunt for ways to squeeze more tax revenue out of the economy, usually targeting those who can most easily afford to pay more. For example, Senator Bernie Sanders insists that a financial transaction tax will cover the cost of making public colleges and universities tuition free. And Senator Elizabeth Warren claims that a 2% tax on fortunes above $50 million would raise enough revenue to wipe out student debt for 95% of students and also pay for universal childcare and free college. In both cases, the goal is to demonstrate that everything can be paid for by taxing the richest people in America. As we'll see in the pages ahead, there's often room to fund new programs without the need for higher taxes. Adding to the deficit shouldn't be looked upon as a taboo. Taxes are critically important, but there's no reason to assume the government must raise taxes whenever it wants to invest in our economy. In practice, the federal government almost never collects enough taxes to offset all of its spendings. Deficit spending is the norm, and everyone in Washington, D.C. knows it, and so do voters. That's why so many politicians complain that Congress needs to get its fiscal house in order before it's too late. To demonstrate their commitment to good, old-fashioned House budgeting, the Democrats, led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, reinstated the budget rule known as pay-as-you-go, PAYGO, in 2018, which was later reversed in 2020. With PAYGO in place, borrowing to finance new expenditures is technically off limits. That reduces TAPS to just tax and spending, TS. So lawmakers face intense pressures to cover any proposed new spending with revenue from new taxes. Is this a good political strategy? Is it good economics? It certainly sounds like a wholesome approach to budgeting, but it's rooted in a flawed understanding of how the federal government actually spends. In fact, it gets everything backward. How the currency issuer spends as TAP. Because it's the dominant way of thinking, most of us probably carry a version of the TABS model in our minds, even if we have never spent a moment of our time thinking about the inner workings of the federal budget. We probably believe that the government needs our money to help pay the bills. We might even feel a bit patriotic about the check we send off to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, every year, April. Proud to have done our small part in building low-income housing, paying our men and women in uniform, and supporting our farmers with generous subsidies. I hate to be the bearer of uncomfortable news, but that's not what's actually happening. If you're not already doing so, you should probably sit down. Are you ready? Your taxes don't actually pay for anything. At least, not at the federal level. The government doesn't need our money. We need their money. We've got the whole thing backward. When I first encountered this way of understanding how taxing and spending work in actual practice, I recoiled. It was in 1997, and I was midway through a PhD program in economics when someone shared a little book called Soft Currency Economics with me. The book's author, Warren Mosler, was a successful Wall Street investor, not an economist, and this book was about how the economics profession was getting almost everything wrong. I read it, and I wasn't convinced. According to Mosler, the government spends first and then taxes or borrows. That sequencing turns Thatcher's dictum completely around, reordering the mnemonic to give us STAB, spending before taxing and borrowing. By Mosler's reasoning, the government doesn't go around looking for someone else to pick up the tab. It just spends its currency into existence. Warren saw things that most economists were missing. To many of us, his ideas initially sounded completely original, but most weren't. They were only new to us. It turns out they could be found, and we found them. And canonical texts, like Adam Smith Wealth of Nations, or in John Maynard Keynes' 2-volume classic, A Treatise on Money. Anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, and others had long ago arrived at similar conclusions about the nature of money, on the role of taxes. But the economics profession had largely lagged behind. Mosler is considered the father of MMT because he brought these ideas to a handful of us in the 1990s. He says he doesn't know how he came up with this way of understanding taxing and government spending, but that it just struck him after years of experience working the financial markets. He was used to thinking in terms of debits and credits, debits and credits, excuse me, because he had been trading financial instruments and watching funds transfer between bank accounts. One day, he started to think about where all those dollars must have originally come from. It occurred to him that before the government could subtract debit, any dollars away from us, it must first add credit, them. He reasoned that spending must have come first. Otherwise, where would anyone have gotten the dollars they needed to pay the tax? Although the logic seemed infallible, I felt certain his story couldn't be right. How could it? It turned everything I understood about money, taxes, and government spending on its head. I had studied economics with world-renowned economists at Cambridge University, and none of my professors have ever said anything like this. In fact, all of the models they taught me were compatible with Thatcher's dictum that governments must tax or borrow before they can spend. Was it really possible that nearly everyone had it wrong? I had to find out. In 1998, I visited Mosler at his home in West Palm Beach, Florida, where I spent hours listening to him explain his thinking. He began by referring to the US dollar as, quote, a simple public monopoly. Since the US government is the sole source of dollars, it was silly to think of Uncle Sam as needing to get dollars from the rest of us. Obviously, the issue of the dollar can have all the dollars it could possibly want. Quote, the government doesn't want dollars. Mosler explained, quote, it wants something else. What does it want? I asked. It wants to provision itself, he replied. Quote, the tax isn't there to raise money. It's there to get people working, producing things for the government. And quote, what kinds of things, I asked. Quote, a military, a court system, public parks, hospitals, roads, bridges, that kind of stuff. To get the population to do all that work, the government imposes taxes, fees, fines, or other obligations. The tax is there to create a demand for the government's currency. Before anyone can pay the tax, someone has to do the work to earn the currency. My head spun. Then he told me a story. Mosler had a beautiful beachfront property with a swimming pool and all the luxuries of life anyone could hope to enjoy. He also had a family that included 2 young kids. To illustrate his point, he told me a story about the time he sat his kids down and told them he wanted them to do their part to help keep the place clean and habitable. He wanted the yard mowed, beds made, dishes done, cars washed, and so on. To compensate them for their time, he offered to pay them for their labor. 3 of his business cards if they made their beds, 5 for doing their dishes, 10 for washing a car, and 25 for tending the yard work. Days turned to weeks, and the house became increasingly uninhabitable. The grass grew knee-high, dishes piled up in the sink, and the cars were covered in sand and salt from the ocean breeze. Quote, why aren't you doing any work? Mosler asked the kids. Quote, I told you I would pay you some of my business cards to pitch in around here. Dad, the kids intoned, quote, why would we work for your business cards? They're not worth anything. That's when Mosler had his epiphany. The kids hadn't done any chores because they didn't need his cards. So he told the kids he wasn't requiring them to do any work at all. All he wanted was a payment of 30 of his business cards each month. Failure to pay would result in a loss of privileges. No more TV, use of the swimming pool, or trips to the mall. It was a stroke of genius. Mosler had imposed a, quote, tax that could only be paid using his own monogrammed paper. Now the cards were worth something. Within hours, the kids were scurrying around, tidying up the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the yard. What was once considered a worthless rectangular calling card was suddenly perceived as a valuable token. But why? How did Mosler get the kids to do all that work without forcing them to do any chores? Simple. He put them in a situation where they needed to earn his, quote, currency, to stay out of trouble. Each time the kids did some work, they got a receipt, some business cards, for the task they had performed. At the end of the month, the kids returned the cards to their father. As Moser explained, he didn't actually need to collect his own cards back from the kids. Quote, "What would I want with my own tokens?" he asked. He had already gotten what he really wanted out of the deal, a tidy house. He had already gotten what so why did he bother taxing the cards away from the kids? Why didn't he let them hold on to them as souvenirs? The reason was simple. Moser collected the cards so the kids would need to earn them again next month. He had invented a virtuous provisioning system. Virtuous in this case means that it keeps repeating. Moser used the story to illustrate some basic principles about the way sovereign currency issuers actually fund themselves. Taxes are there to create a demand for government currency. The government can define the currency in terms of its own unique unit of account, a dollar, a yen, a pound, a peso, and then give value to its own otherwise worthless paper by requiring any payment of taxes or other obligations. As Mahler jokes, quote, taxes turn litter into currency. At the end of the day, a currency issuing government wants something real, not something monetary. It's not our own tax money the government wants, it's our time. To get us to produce things for the state, the government invents taxes on other kinds of payment obligations. This isn't the explanation you'll find in most economic textbooks. Where's a superficial story about money being invented to overcome the inefficiencies associated with bartering. Trading goods without the use of money is preferred. In that story, money is just a convenient device that sprang up organically as a way to make trade more efficient. Although students are taught that barter was once omnipresent, a sort of natural state of being, scholars of the ancient world have found little evidence that societies were ever organized around the barter exchange. MMT rejects the ahistorical barter narrative, drawing instead on an extensive body of scholarship known as chartalism, which shows that taxes were the vehicle that allowed ancient rulers and early nation states to introduce their own currencies, which only later circulated as a medium of exchange among private individuals. For example, from inception, this tax liability creates people looking for paid work, aka unemployment, into the government's currency. The government, or the other authority, then spends its currency into existence, giving people access to the tokens they need to settle their obligations to the state. Obviously, no one can pay the tax until the government first applies its tokens. As a simple point of logic, Moser explains that most of us had the sequencing wrong. Taxpayers weren't funding the government was funding the taxpayers. I'm going to leave that off here. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. I'm liking this so far. I hope you guys will be able to learn a thing or two. There's a lot of misconceptions about how government works, where the money comes from, where the money actually goes. Like, do they spend taxpayer money or do they spend their own money? I know every government's different. Some governments, in the European Union, they have to rely on the euro, and that's a totally different conversation. But that's a lot different compared to the United States or Japan or the other countries mentioned, where we are the sole owner of our own currency. So I think that's a really big deal to understand. And also, I know in my history classes, middle school, high school, right? They said, oh, some students bring up, why can't we just spend unlimited amount of money if we have all this money? We take all this tax dollars, we make all this revenue off of trade. Why can't we just spend all the money we want? And of course, they try to tell us, oh, the United States is going to depression or the dollar would be valued less. In this case, from what Stephanie Cohen has to say, and among the others she references, that's absolutely not true. It's horseshit. In fact, we can do whatever we want. And it excites me to read that because you really get to understanding that we've all been lied to. We've all been brainwashed. I still don't completely understand the modern monetary theory and kind of how all this stuff works. It may seem a bit confusing, and to me it is kind of confusing, but I'm hoping her book will allow you guys to digest it in a simpler way than just being thrown at you a bunch of terminology and jargon and legal words that make no sense. But for her book, I feel like she's really doing a good job so far at the nicest way to be, quote, dumbing it down so that we aren't, reading it like, what the fuck is she trying to say? So at least with this, it's a lot less complex than it appears on paper. So again, I appreciate you guys listening and hope it does pique your interest. And, always feel free to let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And other than that, you guys have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. If you guys have snow, stay warm. If you don't, lucky you.